Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll make that final check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage website for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Dr. Kim Holmes, Distinguished Fellow in our Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. Dr. Holmes previously served Heritage as Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and also directed the Davis Institute. He was a founding editor of the annual Index of Economic Freedom, which has become a signature Heritage publication. From 2002 to 2005, it was his privilege to serve in the George W. Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Widely recognized as one of America's leading conservative voices in national security policy, Dr. Holmes is currently completing work on a book, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great, that unites our domestic and foreign policy ideas into compelling new vision for America's future. It should be released in mid-November. Please join me in welcoming Kim Holmes. Kim?
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a bit unusual for us at Heritage to have an event in this auditorium in the afternoon. We usually do them at lunchtime, and we attract lots of people with food. But I'm glad that all of you made it, and notwithstanding the hour. It's an important topic, and I'd like to thank, in particular, Bob Blackwell, for who's here with us this afternoon, for suggesting the topic and also for suggesting our speakers here. For some time now, certainly over the last year, observers have been wondering about the future direction of Argentina. Argentina watchers certainly know the reasons why. There are basically two issues that have been converging. The first concerns Argentina's debts. After a default in 2001, Argentina refused for 4 years to negotiate with its creditors, but eventually offered them a deal worth 30 cents on the dollar. A second offer came in 2010, in which all but 7% of the bonds were exchanged. That left mainly hedge funds holding the remainder of the debt. Then the hedge funds, went to court. In August, they won a decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York that essentially says Argentina must pay up. But there was a catch. The court said that Argentina cannot pay any creditors if it does not pay all of them. And that caused a lot of headaches in the U.S. Treasury Department and elsewhere in the international financial system because of, in their opinion, the bad precedent that it would set. The other issue is, of course, Iran. In 1994, there was a bombing attack on the Israelite Mutual Association in Argentina. It was one of the deadliest such attacks in South America's history, and it was widely believed to have been carried out by Hezbollah with Iran's approval. And then on the 27th of January of this year, the administration of President Cristina Kirchner signed an agreement with Iran to found a so-called Truth Commission to investigate the bombing. Now, since some of the accused from Iran are now high-ranking officials in Iran, it is assumed by Argentina's critics that the results will be a whitewash of Iran's responsibilities for that attack. Some speculate that Kirchner is pulling Argentina into a camp with Venezuela, who also has ties with Iran. Others wonder if it's not about domestic Argentine politics or about the particular peculiarities of the president's personality. To sort it all out today, we have with us two experts with backgrounds not only in banking but also in intelligence and in terrorism. We'll have I'll introduce both of them right now, and then we'll just have them speak one after the other. The first is Arturo Porzakansky. He is a distinguished economist and resident at American University's School of International Service. He's also the director of International Economic Relations Program, also at American University. He is an expert in international finance, emerging markets, and Latin American economics. He previously taught at Columbia University, New York University, and Williams College, and before that he had a long and distinguished career as a chief economist in a number of America's most prominent banks. Speaking after him is Douglas Farah, is a president of IBI Consultants and a senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. He is a national security consultant and an analyst. In 2004, he worked with the Consortium for the Study of Intelligence, studying armed groups and intelligence reform, and for the two decades before that, he was a foreign correspondent, an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and other publications covering Latin America and West Africa. So, Mr. Porzakowski, you can either stay there or come up here and get us started.
Well, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much, Dr. Holmes, for the invitation to come to the Heritage Foundation and speak about the case of Argentina. And I'll do that by laying some of the groundwork, and then hopefully in the Q&A and follow-up conversations, we can take it from there to discuss the outlook more in detail. Recent headlines out of Kenya and Syria remind us that the world is not as safe a place as we'd like it to be. And that's because of the lingering presence of what international relations experts call bad actors. Some of them are states, others are state-sponsored, and then there are non-state-related actors, like the pirates off the coast of Somalia, recalled in the upcoming movie Captain Phillips, about the first American cargo ship to be hijacked in 200 years, the Maersk Alabama, in 2009. In fact, in our own hemisphere, we have our share of bad actors. And the ones that most readily come to mind are all the narco-traffickers who supply the United States market with most of the illegal drugs that our population consumes in vast quantities. But we also have some states that can be characterized as bad hemispheric actors. And in my view, Argentina should be at the top of the list. A few years ago, I would have said that Venezuela deserved that top spot. But with the passing of Hugo Chavez from the scene, and given the ongoing implosion of the Venezuelan economy and the escalation in organized crime in that country, my assessment is that the government of Nicolás Maduro, hobbled by the poison legacy left by Chavez, is nowadays much less capable of causing mischief throughout the region. To be sure, as the recent finding of 1.4 metric tons of cocaine in 36 suitcases on an Air France flight from Caracas to Paris illustrates, Venezuela remains a major transit point for U.S. and European-destined cocaine. However, it is comforting to know that at least the Maduro administration has not hesitated to arrest 2 National Guard sergeants and 1 lieutenant for alleged involvement in that showcase smuggling. So why regard Argentina as the hemisphere's worst bad actor, you may ask? At first glance, Argentina appears respectable. It remains a member of the G20 club of leading nations. It ranks among the top 30 economies in the world. It is a relatively stable and peaceful democracy, and many of its main economic indicators look quite healthy at first glance. However, a closer look reveals a sorely mismanaged economy that is only superficially democratic, which has been violating property rights and breaking the rules of international trade and finance. Moreover, it's becoming a source of economic and financial instability in South America. Consider that Argentina is the only nation in the G20 group of countries that is in protracted default on its financial obligations to its fellow club members. In the past dozen years, the U.S. Exim Bank, its equivalent export finance banks around the world, and a variety of official foreign aid agencies have not been paid 1 penny in principal or interest on what they are owed an estimated $9 billion by now. Argentina has also defied over 100 court judgments obtained mainly by American investors and principally in the United States, despite Argentina having formally pledged to abide by U.S. laws and to respect the decisions of U.S. courts when it sold in the 1990s government bonds worth tens of billions of dollars through U.S. and other jurisdictions, bonds on which it later defaulted. In addition, Argentina is the G20 member with by far the most investor claims against it in various international arbitration tribunals. In that context, it has likewise refused to pay up on arbitral awards decided against it in proceedings concluded by ICSID, the world's premier dispute resolution center, of which Argentina is a willing member. The cases are piling up because, as recently demonstrated with the expropriation of Repsol's majority stake in the flagship oil company YPF, which is surely worth many billions of dollars, Argentina refuses to pay even a single cent in compensation for the takeover. Argentina is also the only country in the G20 that refuses to abide by its treaty obligations to the International Monetary Fund under Articles 4 and 8 of its founding charter. The former relates to the obligation of member states to subject themselves to an annual checkup of economic conditions, but Argentina has refused to host an IMF inspection team since 2006. One of the reasons is that the authorities in Buenos Aires do not wish to be questioned on their economic statistics, a contentious issue because countries are obligated to furnish reliable data to the IMF, and official figures on inflation and economic growth have become widely discredited. The fund has recently formally censured Argentina for its failings in this regard, the first nation in decades to be reprimanded publicly like that. During the past half-dozen years, the country has been performing steadily worse in terms of democratic governance, institution building, sound economics, rule of law, and the protection of property rights. As you may have heard, government controls on prices, wages, imports, exports, the exchange rate, capital remittances, in sum, nearly everything that moves, have distorted the economy and robbed it of its potential. And journalists, economists, businessmen, and political leaders who have dared to speak the truth or to question the increasingly authoritarian climate have been persecuted and sometimes even prosecuted. Consequently, Argentina has sunk very low in various measures of creditworthiness, the business climate, competitiveness, transparency, corruption, and economic liberty. In the Heritage Foundation's ranking of economic freedom, Argentina has been dropping like a rock for years and has now reached the 160th place out of a total of 177 ranked countries, barely beating the likes of Venezuela and Cuba. In conclusion, Argentina has become an outlier in the community of nations, a free rider of the G20, a rogue sovereign debtor, a bad host for trade and investment, and as I'm sure my fellow panelist Doug Farah will explain, also a bad actor in the world in terms of its tolerance for narco-trafficking and its alliances with other bad national actors such as Iran. I'll be glad to discuss the economic and financial scenarios for Argentina a little bit later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Arturo, for that great setting the stage, and thank you to Heritage Foundation for hosting this event. I tend to talk very quickly, so if I do, you can ask me to settle down a little bit. I would like to look at a few, maybe three of the issues I think are fundamentally important in looking at Argentina as a bad actor. And if you're interested, I've done two big papers earlier this month, which I can direct you to on the website if you're interested in following up any of these in more detail. But I think the main concerns to me are in three particular areas. One is the rule of law, which Arturo talked about a bit. The second is Argentina's growing role as a center for transnational organized crime, particularly the methamphetamine trade and the cocaine trade that mostly migrates toward Europe, and their growing relationship of Argentina with Iran and Venezuela. I think that if you look at the history of what Argentina has been in recent years, you notice a remarkable and rather abrupt shift, beginning particularly with the second term of Cristina. During the terms of her husband, Nestor was a much more measured person. He may not have been less corrupt, but he was certainly more measured in how he dealt with the outside world. For years, Argentina had been walking out of the United Nations General Assembly when Iran took the podium because they're protesting over Iran's participation in the Amia killing bombings of 1994. And if you read the wonderful investigation that the prosecutor Alberto Nisman, he's done two reports, one in 2006 and one earlier this year, which lay out in excruciating detail over 800 pages the role of Iran and Hezbollah in those particular assassination attempts, those crimes against humanity. And one of the things I think is worth recalling as we talk about this possible thaw with Iran and rapprochement with Iran and things like that, is this is from Mr. Nisman's initial indictment of the Amia bombers that he issued in 2006. The decision to carry out the attack was made not by a small splinter group of extremist Islamic officials, but was instead a decision that was extensively discussed and ultimately adopted by a consensus of the highest representatives of the Iranian government at the time within the context of a foreign policy that was quite willing to resort to violence in order to achieve the goals that are inherent to the Islamic Republic that was established by the revolution in February 1979. I think it's well worth remembering what we knew about Iran, what Mr. Nisman has explained about Iran and the relationship in Latin America, because what Mr. Nisman does, and others have done it, and I spend a great deal of my time working both inside and outside the government on this particular issue, is you can trace Iran's activity in Argentina not back to 1994, but back to 1983. At the very inception of the Iranian Revolution, they made a strategic decision to move into Latin America for a variety of reasons, primarily they viewed it always, and they write about this extensively in their own publications, and the original literature is rather fascinating, where they talk about taking Latin America with grenades and AK-47s as their sort of methodology going forward. So the fact that they carry out a series of bombings, the first against the Israeli embassy and then against the Amia bombing in 1994 should not surprise us if we have been following what Iran actually says it wants to do and how it will do it. And I think one of the most interesting things in my work recently is there are a bunch of declassified CIA documents on the CIA website that look at what we knew about the Iranian network in the 1990s following the Amia bombing and how closely we followed it. And we knew quite a bit about it. We understood exactly what they were doing, and we forgot it all in fairly short order. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind as you look at what is the relationship as it develops with Argentina. I think in the relationship between Argentina and Iran is certainly not independent of the relationship with Venezuela. I think that one of the things that binds Cristina to what she hopes will be a new world order is the firm conviction that the Bolivarian Revolution, led by Hugo Chavez when he was alive, now carried on by Nicolás Maduro and Correa and Evo Morales in Bolivia, is the future. And she's made a very clear and conscious decision to move away from Argentina's historically fairly close relationship with the United States into the Bolivarian camp. And the first serious indication of this that we saw publicly was Chavez funding her campaign to the tune of the $800,000 that were caught in the suitcase in Miami of Venezuelans carrying undeclared cash contributions to Cristina's campaign. campaign in 2007, resulted in a conviction in the Miami court, and it's a matter of public record where that money originated and where it was going to. But that was the first really clear indication that Cristina and Mr. Chavez were going to begin a lovely relationship that would go forward. What does Argentina desperately need at this particular time, and why is part of the reason why it's in the dire economic straits? It needs energy. It's desperately, last year it had been a net, not an importer of fuel for a considerable period of time. Last year it had to import $14 billion worth of fuel, and this year it will probably be in the neighborhood of $14 to $16 billion, which shoots a very large hole in their budget because they were not anticipating that. And the one thing that Argentina had and could export was the food, the soy and the beef and things, and what Venezuela had to offer them was energy in exchange. And so you saw the beginning of this relationship, largely a disaster for both sides because neither side fulfilled any of the agreements that they set out and signed, particularly Argentina in this case, and they now owe Venezuela massive amounts of money. And one of the solutions that Nicolás Maduro breached with President Cristina earlier this year after Chavez died, one of the first trips of Maduro was to Argentina, where he asked for the one thing that Argentina has that Venezuela desperately wants, which is nuclear power. He said they could pay off their debt with a nuclear reactor. Argentina has two that are functioning. It is actually a pioneer and has a very robust both nuclear energy the sustaining company that's run by the local state governments, not by the central government so much, as well as a very robust space program and very robust and very advanced medical technologies program. So they're not by any means a third world nation in that regard. And so what Venezuela wants out of that relationship is what they can't have in the broader world, nuclear energy. And you see indications that other things are in the works. Argentina supposedly dismantled its Condor II missile program at the end of the 1980s, going into the democratic process, early 1990s. We found out last year that they had never actually dismantled it, and in fact had reactivated it in the middle of last year. One of the things Iran desperately wants is missile technology. If you talk with folks who really follow the nuclear issue, and I know there's a lot of discussion over this, excuse me, and I'm certainly no expert, but a lot of people tell you Iran needs much less help on its nuclear program than it does on its missile program. It can get to the bomb. It can't. What it does not have is a delivery system to move that bomb out of Tehran, and they probably don't want to set it off in Tehran, one would guess. So that synergy there, and what you see is this series of hundreds of bilateral agreements that are signed between Argentina and Venezuela that allow for the flow of all kinds of technology back and forth with relatively unsupervised. And as Arturo mentioned earlier, what you have is an increasingly small group of people able to provide oversight to the government. Everything is becoming more and more opaque as Cristina digs in and develops this very personal, what was a very personal relationship with Hugo Chavez, not an institutionalized state-to-state relationship, but a very personal relationship with Cristina deciding what would be done in Chavez. Now Maduro, a few people like Julio De Vido and other people deeply involved, but it's not a state-to-state policy in which the Congress has much oversight or anything to say about it. And so you see this series of strange events where Argentina, after years of acknowledging publicly that Iran was responsible for the Amia bombing and stuff, suddenly coming up with miraculously the virgin birth of this memorandum of understanding in which not only will there be a truth commission, but Iran is going to collaborate in its ability, in its help with the investigation, which would all be quite laughable, except that it actually became government policy. And what was really fascinating, because I was in Argentina as this was going down, when they first presented the memorandum of understanding, Foreign Minister Timmerman said, okay, this is what it is. And our prosecutors will be able to go to Iran, they'll be able to question Iranian officials, they'll be able to do this and be able to do that. The next day, Iran always responded, no, you won't. You will not have access to Defense Minister Vahidi, who's under Interpol red notice. You won't, you won't, you won't. And at every case, the third day, Timmerman would come and say, okay, sorry, oops, I was wrong, you're right. That's not what the agreement says. And they ceded every major point to the Iranian interpretation with no discussion. which in the context of the political price Cristina is paying internally for having done this is significant. It's like spending a lot of political capital on something that has no rational repayment process, unless there's something else under the surface that one doesn't see, which I strongly believe there is. There's no other reason why Iran and Argentina would suddenly have this miraculous reapproachment. And we do know from what Cristina has said and what others have who have much closer inside knowledge than myself have written and talked about, there was a great deal of pressure and requests from Iran to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to open the door to Argentina. Why? Because in part because of what we talked about before, but also lost in sort of the history of Iran and Argentina's relationship was Iran built the nuclear reactors. Argentina built the nuclear reactors that Argentina has today. And there was an extensive training program in the late 1980s, early 1990s, between the two countries where Argentina was training the Iranian scientists. And there was a huge amount of exchange. And one of the things that Prosecutor Niesman identifies as the trigger event for the AMIA bombings was that Argentina, with U.S. pressure, had finally said, okay, we're not going to continue this relationship. We can't keep training. You can't keep going back. We've given you retrofitted reactors. We can't do any more. And at that point, Iran makes the decision to carry out the AMIA bombings. And I'd just like to touch briefly on drug trafficking. I've spent way too long, 3 decades, maybe more, looking at transnational drug flows, particularly in Latin America. And one of the really striking things is Argentina's growing prominent role. There's actually a really good short documentary done by Vice TV. I'm unfamiliar with that. People much younger than me, I guess, watched it. But I've seen it, and it's really good on the total lack of control on the Bolivia-Argentine border. And they film people carrying 30-kilo bags of cocaine by the hundreds across the border, in which there's absolutely no control on either side of the border. It's rather remarkable. And in talking to the journalist who did the documentary, one of the things that doesn't come out in the documentary, but what he had investigated was the enormous rise in violence in an area. I grew up in Bolivia. I've been down in that region many times before. It was always completely benign. There was nothing ever going on there. The level of violence is rising really rapidly, which is always an indication that cartels and different groups are fighting for control over the different routes that are going through there. And the other thing, Argentina has the highest per capita consumption of cocaine in the world. About 10 to 15% of the cocaine that traffics through stays in country, which historically in countries that are transit zones is very high. It's not usually nearly that much. And most of the routes go through to West Africa and then up to Europe, and so it's not a particular concern to the United States. But the DEA has done a lot of work on this, and I think there'll be some interesting cases in the not too distant future. So I think, what has really affected the current government is the methamphetamine trade. And if you dig in, which I did it's in the report that I did earlier this year, there was Argentina until 2009 had absolutely zero control over the movement of chemicals into its country. All you had to do was declare what you were bringing in. So they were bringing in ephedrine, which is legally used to make cough syrup and things. On the illicit side, it's a necessary precursor to make methamphetamines. And what you saw over the time, because we were able to track their import figures because they declared them because there was no reason not to, the legal market for ephedrine in Argentina was about 0.8 tons, maybe 1 ton a year for their needs, acknowledged by the medical industry. They were importing 28 tons. Seemed a little excessive, perhaps, for what the market would bear. But then it turns out, as we were investigating, there were government-controlled shipping entities that were shipping huge amounts of that. It arrives from China, moves into Argentina, and then was transiting up on a specific shipping line, largely to Mexico, to where the meth trade was really taking off. And if you look at Cristina's campaign contribution records, about a third of her declared campaign contributions, there are probably a lot more that weren't declared, but a third of the declared ones were from people who have been convicted or known to be involved in the methamphetamine trade. So it's a really interesting dynamic between that particular part of the trade in her campaign directly, and the people who are very close during the campaign. I just want to finish by talking very briefly about something I found fascinating, and which I'm sure Arturo knows a great deal about, is the role of this group of people that call themselves La Cámpora in Argentina, which is really fascinating. It's a group of young people that Nestor Kirchner started nurturing. His son runs the movement. And they've taken over, they've gained a great deal of power in the Cristina government, particularly in recent years, and I would argue that they are probably the most corrupting influence internally in Argentina because they have access to Aerolíneas Argentinas, the pension funds. They run the state government pension funds, and they have access to literally hundreds of millions of dollars, which have been disappearing at a staggering rate. They don't seem to be, I think they probably take a lot of it for their personal use. A lot of it is for, and if you read their literature, it's really fascinating. Their ambassador in Washington is one of the a prime mover of the movement. They write, they have this mixture of Marxist, utopian, fascist, never land quality to their economic program. And it's really fascinating to read their books because I'm not a trained economist, but it's absolute gibberish. There's nothing. They just believe that the rules don't apply to them. Inflation doesn't go up if you print more money. Supply and demand have no particular relationship to each other. It's all of this really remarkable stuff written in great detail. But if you don't understand La Cámpora, you can't understand what's happening in Argentina today. And as Cristina has become more and more isolated, somewhat more reliant on her son, Máximo, and the Cámpora has gained more strength, you see a lot of the really sort of seemingly irrational economic decisions being taken, and a lot of the state funding disappearing into this great black hole that the Cámpora has become. So I think that if you look at all of those factors together, and as I say, I've written extensively on this, you can read much more than you probably want to know. I think Argentina is clearly on a road that's very similar in some ways to what Venezuela has already gone down much further. And if they don't, if the process doesn't stop soon, I think you'll have a significant deterioration of the rule of law. Drug trafficking will continue to rise, and Argentina will become a major player with Iran. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. I thought what I'd do is give each one of you, I ask you both two questions. And then maybe if you could spend no more than 5 minutes just responding to it, and then I'll open it up to the audience so they can place some questions. So basically two questions. One is that, basically, what is the outlook for the future? How much of what we're talking about here is endemic to Argentina, the society, the economy, the political ruling classes, and how much of it is the result of the peculiarities of Cristina Kirchner and her particular situation? And more broadly, which is the question we were discussing in the chamber out here, is what are the indicators today of what we mean when we talk about a bad actor, an outlier, if you will, of the international law and the international system? And we've pretty much got the indicators here in terms of the international financial situation, drug trafficking, and then support for terrorism. I guess those are the ones, but I guess the question I would ask in that particular vein is, what does this mean for Latin America, and to have a country like Argentina engaged in these kinds of activities? And it's not normally rises to the level of a strategic interest of the United States to care about everything that happens in Latin America, but this is a peculiar and potentially serious combination of developments and connections that could actually rise to that level. So anything you want to add to that, but those are the questions I'd like to throw out to you.
Well, a little bit on the outlook, and we can certainly talk a lot more about that. Fundamentally, it's up to the Argentine people whether they will want to be kept taken down this path or not. We're seeing signs that the Argentine people are rebelling against this prospect. We began to, there were some primary elections last month, and basically the candidates backed by Cristina for midterm congressional elections that will take place at the end of October did poorly. Her own polls, have shown a plummeting popularity. So clearly, you see it all over, much more a lot of jokes about her and a lot of people speaking badly of her and so on, as opposed to a couple of years ago where, in general, her poll numbers were pretty good and people were willing to go along for the ride. The next step, as I mentioned, is the congressional elections at the end of October. Chances are that, once again, her candidates will not do well in those midterm elections. And what we're seeing is not opposition parties benefiting from the plunge in popularity for Cristina, but other factions within Peronism benefiting. So we have a number of mayors and governors that are daring to speak up and are daring to, not toe the party line anymore. And this is something that we've seen in Argentina before, that oftentimes change within Peronism takes place. And so I would say chances are that she's going to be challenged more and more starting in early November by people within the party. And then she'll have a choice whether to, double the bet and try to make it to the end of her term at the end of 2015, which is a long time given the trend of deterioration in most numbers. 2+ years, a long time to make it to the end. Or if she starts to change some things. For instance, if she offers up the La Cámpora boys as sacrificial lamb and brings new people into her cabinet other than yes men, and starts to change some of her policies. So I don't think what happens outside of Argentina will tend to matter all that much. We've seen countries, Iran is, of course, in the news these days with the UN meeting and so on. But when you think, or Cuba, countries that have been officially sanctioned and isolated and so on, for the most part, the record is that they can continue for many years pursuing their goals, maybe in a less ambitious manner, maybe they can't export their revolution as much, but they can still do in their own territory what they want. Of course, as long as the government becomes more and more autocratic. And so I think it's mainly up to the Argentine people, although it would certainly help if not only the United States, but other partners of Argentina, like Brazil, say, were to stand up and be counted. Because you have to be able to look past the sham of a democratic process. The kind of manipulations are going on, the kind of intolerance for opposition, the kind of authoritarian things that we're seeing are something that even Argentina's neighbors, Chile, Uruguay, Peru, Brazil, should hopefully stand up also and say, if you keep up like this, we're not going to do business with you in some form or another. So some international pressure would be very good. But basically, it's up to the Argentine people. And as I say, I think that her chances to end the mandate in the Pink House, as the White House is called over there, are less than 50-50. And what I see is not a military coup or not a popular revolution in the streets, but basically maneuvers within the Peronist party such that a number of influential governors and mayors one day persuade her to take that last helicopter ride home.
Well, thank you. I'll just add a couple of things. I think one of the things that's really important in Argentina that separates it from Venezuela and others in the Bolivarian court is that they still had a Supreme Court that's relatively independent and sectors of the judicial system that have been relatively independent, and they've blocked key rulings by Cristina that would have taken them much more further down that road and much more quickly than they were actually able to go, because the Supreme Court put a brake on it, including the law, the rulings on Clarín and the media laws that she's tried to push through, and the reforms of the judicial system itself, which were intended to gut the judicial system. They didn't let those stand, and so she's become much more. She hadn't reached the point that Chavez had been able to, Evo Morales had been able to just decapitate the Supreme Court with impunity and then set into effect a Supreme Court that was essentially going to agree with whatever they said. The other thing I found really interesting in her speech yesterday at the UN General Assembly was this sort of plea to Iran to please ratify the memorandum of understanding that she is paying such a high cost for internally for doing. Iran signed it with all the, what they say in Spanish, bombos y platillos, everything was great, and then Iran just shut up. They just never did anything. Ahmadinejad, on his way out, there were press reports from Iran that he had signed the agreement, decided that they didn't need the Iranian parliament to approve it. He could just approve it himself. Apparently that's not true. Iran has given no indication that they're going to go ahead or not go ahead. And she had this really sort of tragic plea to Iran saying, please tell us if you're going to do this or not do it. We need to know, which tells you, I think, a little bit about how even Iran may be viewing her. If you look at her use of the Malvinas Falkland issue as well, every time a president gets in trouble down there, this comes back as a big thing, and this was one of the main topics of her speech yesterday as well. So I think she's clearly feeling the pressure on multiple fronts, and I think that one of the sort of the great advantage of people, I think Arturo's right, the Argentines have to, for themselves, sort this out, but ultimately, Cristina has done herself no favor. She's alienated Dilma. She's alienated Chile. She's alienated Spain. She's alienated Britain. She's alienated the United States. She's alienated Uruguay. The president of Uruguay came out and said she was an ugly old hag, and the only worst person looking was her cross-eyed husband who had already died or something. Not a great way to make friends and influence people. Brazil has frozen a lot of their investments. They've backtracked on all the major investments they had going forward there. And so there's a lot of tension among people with people that are nations that Argentina would traditionally be allied with. So I think the pressure is already there, and it's a lot harder to say, Brazil go home than Yankee go home. It doesn't quite resonate the same across Latin America. So I think she's in deep trouble. On the indicators of bad actors, I think that one of the things the United States has traditionally done quite well is have markers on human rights, markers on press freedom, markers on economic freedoms that have been tried, that they've applied. I wouldn't say certainly not perfectly, but I think there's been an attempt over decades to apply in relatively even-handed fashion certain metrics to people to nations across the world in specific areas that we are interested in, and I think that. Those are significant indicators, although in the case of Argentina and even Venezuela, it has not yet led to serious actions against those governments or penalties being applied to those governments. I think that there are numerous other indicators one could use. I think the relationship of the senior government officials with transnational organized crime would be a significant one. I think a lot of issues on transparency need to be defined. The willingness to abide by international rulings when you sign up to go to international arbitration. All of those things could be used to define bad actors. But I think that one of the sort of taken together what you see with the Bolivarian Revolution and in moving forward a bit in Argentina is the complete disinstitutionalization of the country and the personalization of leadership in every way possible in the hands of the president. I think this was a deliberate policy of the Bolivarian Revolution. I think Cristina loves it because she'd like to be queen of everything if she could. But it's not a stretch for authoritarian leaders to move to deinstitutionalize in every way they can the judicial system, the press, the military. You see Cristina now decapitating the military and moving up a whole 35 top officers gone and a whole new group of relatively low-ranking people that are loyal to her pushed to the forefront. So you see these moves when the institutions are weak enough, and I think to the benefit of Argentina, at least the court systems have not been so weakened that they couldn't stand up to her, and I think that's helped.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's your turn. Do we have microphones? Yeah, okay. All right. If you could briefly just identify yourself, best to ask a question. If you want to make a comment, that's fine, but keep it short. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Bill Wichterman at Covington and Brilling. Question for Mr. Farah. You mentioned kind of obliquely that there might be other reasons that Argentina would have had this rapprochement with Iran. And I wonder if you could speculate or repeat the speculations of others as to what that might be, because geopolitically it doesn't seem to make much sense.
I think the answer is energy. I think that they're desperate for energy, and if you look at how shipping movements move from Iran and the ships that come out of different ports in the former Soviet republics and then down to Argentina, I think that there's a reasonable possibility that there's a lot of mixing of Iranian oil into other oils that are then being sent into Argentina. So I think energy would be the answer to what would be the driving factor behind that, and the desperate desire to stave off economic collapse. I think if you look at how Argentina's foreign reserves have fallen, how their inflation has risen, how they have this dollar crisis, they have the regular dollar, then they have the blue dollar, now they have the deep blue dollar. I mean, it's getting a little bit dicey for her. And I think one of the things that's different about Argentina from, let's say, Haiti, is that people are used to having a middle-class life. When you take that away, you have a lot of really angry people. If you've never known what it's like to be middle class, you don't miss having electricity and things that you never had. If you've had all that stuff and it's suddenly taken away from you, you get a lot of really angry and bitter people. And I think you're seeing, particularly in Buenos Aires, but I think probably more broadly, as the numbers are showing in the polls, that she's reached the point where people no longer view her as a leader that they would like to, whose path they would like to follow. But on the other side, you have the camporistas pushing all these completely irrational policies that she seems to be willing to take on for no other reason that her son thinks that these guys are smart and should be in charge. And so it's it's an interesting dilemma for her as to how she's going to sort that out. But I think for Iran, the answer is energy.
Drew, you want to say anything? No. Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Ed Verona. Verona, and I'm an independent consultant. That's a question I have for both Douglas and for Arturo. You mentioned the need for energy resources, but Argentina has tight oil reserves that are larger than the U.S. Combined tight oil estimated reserves. In spite of the nationalization of YPF, or renationalization of it, a couple of major deals have been signed with international oil companies. One particularly large one, multi-billion-dollar deal with a leading U.S. oil company. How can you explain why or how companies are still willing to do major deals like this with a government that has a history, as you've described it, of nationalization or violation or abrogation of its obligations, debt obligations, and other contracts?
So I'll venture a guess. I mean, it'd be easier to say that it boggles the mind why Chevron or some others, why not name them, they're public, would do this. But I think that having had the colleagues in the oil companies, I think, they just go where the oil is. And they are willing to deal with all kinds of people in order to just have a place at the table. I'd be curious to see how much money actually, any of these companies spends. But signing a piece of paper, committing to over many years, so I would imagine they're just buying a seat at the table. These are large reserves, down the road. Even if they started to work on them tomorrow, they'd probably take like 10 years to come on stream. So we're talking about a big project. I think they want a seat at the table, and they're willing to deal even with the devil, and they've done this all over the world, and that's what they do. But I would be surprised if they were to spend a lot of money before they get greater assurances and clarity in, for instance, the pricing of oil and, retail prices, wholesale prices, the rules of trade, to what extent they'll be able to export any of it, and so on. Because if you look at what has happened in recent years, you'd have zero faith in your ability to make a buck or to take it home with you dealing with this crowd. So I think they're probably looking at some horizon. They figure, okay, she's not going to be around very long, so let's just buy a seat at the table and we'll spend a little, a few nickels, and hopefully 2-3 years down the road, there's a more rational administration we can deal with. That would be my realistic explanation.
I would just emphasize what I was sort of saying at the end. I think it's the end of Cristina, and I think they know that. And there's no one on the horizon that has a chance of becoming president that's more radical than she is in this sense. In other words, you're going to get a better government regardless of which of the Peronista sectors wins. It's not going to be Cristina, and the Campo is not going to survive. And I think if you look internally, as the money and the backing moves away from Cristina toward Scioli, toward a lot of other people, she's essentially done. And I think that if I were Chevron making a calculation, I think it wouldn't be hard to imagine that sort of said, you don't have too long to wait. Even if she runs out her term, she won't have the power to do what she was doing before.
They'll still have to deal with Repsol in the courts. That'll be an issue. They may want back what they lost.
Yeah. Right. And the whole Repsol thing is not going to go away. They could, of course, reach a settlement with Repsol, like they could reach a settlement with their bondholders for a fraction of what reaching a settlement with Repsol will take. But there's just been no willingness to negotiate, and that's really what's missing. So they've been creating liabilities and problems for themselves, and somebody's going to have to deal with them for sure.
We had right here.
Barbara Bowie Whitman. In thinking about Argentina over many, many years, it seems to me that they're sort of the opposite, the antithesis of a phoenix. They have an infinite capacity to self-destruct whenever they seem to be getting going well. So now, are you coming to a conclusion that perhaps they've hit such a low point that maybe they can have another cycle of doing well?
So yes, indeed, it's a depressing regularity in Argentina that for a few years they let the animal spirits of the economy do what they do so well, and the economy booms, and then they get greedy and get into these redistribution type policies, and they take from those who produce and give to those who don't produce, and before you know it, the incentive system is upside down. And the one thing that the Kirchners have had going in their favor these years has been this tremendous boom in commodity prices. And also, even though they don't have access to the international capital markets, the climate of ultra low interest rates in Japan, North America, and Europe has also worked in their favor in other ways. If commodity prices were at average levels of the last 20 or 30 years, I think things would have cracked a lot sooner. And even though commodities have all come down from their peak levels, what's coming in is still enough to feed the machine. They can't increase spending as much as they could before. They can't increase imports as much as they could before, et cetera. And as you might know, despite controls and so on, their official holdings of international reserves are steadily dropping. So it's not possible, really, or realistic to say that, well, they might get lucky and interest rates in the world might go down in the next 5 years, or commodity prices might skyrocket. That's already happened. So both in the case of Venezuela and Argentina, I would say populism is running out of gas, literally. And it's only a question of when they're going to have to deal with a budget constraint and with a scarcity of dollars and with all these things. And hopefully that will lead some future government to once again invite those who are wanting to invest and produce to take advantage of the riches of the country.
Yes, sir.
Winston Wilkinson. Just had a comment and would like to hear your thoughts on it. But at least the way I see Latin America, there's, and I think the index bears this out. You have Chile, Colombia, Peru, which are both allied with the U.S., but also have kind of very open economies. You could throw Panama and Mexico in there as well. And then you obviously have Venezuela, Bolivia on the opposite side of that. And my view has always been, in Argentina, I've been hesitant to put them in there because I think the only thing Argentina is lacking right now is just the right leadership. And if Cristina moved out of the way, the economy and the country would rebound fairly quickly. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you share the same views. If not, why?
I'll just start. I don't believe in a quick rebound, or certainly not a painless rebound, because, as was mentioned, say, utility prices have all been held frozen for years. So at some point, they're going to have to raise, telephone and cable TV and water and electric power and so on prices. And it's going to have to be a pretty large increase. The parallel to that in Venezuela, of course, starts with gasoline there, where you can fill a tank of gas for $1 or so. So some of those price adjustments are not going to be popular and could unleash, who knows what. So I don't see any kind of painless or speedy or easy passage from this socialism without a plan and capitalism without markets to something that makes some sense. It's just like back there at the end of 2001. There was no easy way to get off the one-to-one to the dollar, just like there would have been no easy way for Greece to exit the euro without a lot of broken dishes. So that's why, incidentally, a lot of the opposition, which in the past sometimes picked up the pieces from the Peronists, is now volunteering for the job of cleanup. So we'll have to see. So I think, at some point things are going to get pretty rocky, whether they do something or they don't. And how it's all handled, kid gloves and good luck won't be enough to keep this a very, peaceful transition, I think.
I would just say that they moved, I think, a lot closer to the Bolivarian camp in the last 3 or 4 years. I think before that, it was fairly clear they were keeping their distance. With Cristina's second term and the Chavez financing and sort of the relationship that developed between them, you saw her taking a lot of the identical steps that Ecuador and Bolivia had taken following Chavez's lead. They didn't get as far, I think, as she probably would have wanted. She got a late start on the process. So I don't think they are Bolivarian. I think she would like to have been. And I think if the deal with Iran had rebounded to her favor quickly and something had come to that, she would have jumped entirely in that ship. She hasn't been able to. And as she loses power or as her popularity falls, I think she's going to be more constrained in what she can do. I don't think it's from lack of desire. I think the circumstances just didn't play out for her to do what she would have liked to have done.
I wanted to get right to you 1 second. Let me change the focus a bit away from Argentina to the United States. So 2 questions for both of you. Well, how do you assess the Obama administration is handling relations with Argentina? State Department as well. And secondly, part of that, given going back to the discussion about international standards and the like, why should Americans care? What's going on there? What's our interest in the matter?
Well, I'll take a stab. I think I'm in a safe place here to say that I think the Obama administration has a bit of a problem in dealing with bad actors around the world, generally. And I think this is the case also with Argentina. There have been numerous occasions where the administration could have stood up and be counted and encouraged others in Latin America to do the same. There's no reason to go it alone. But in general, the administration has been very reluctant to not necessarily confront Argentina, but just give them a nudge out of the club, or take away some of the red carpet and so on. There have been very tentative steps as of late. One of them was a decision announced over a year ago that the U.S. would oppose loans to Argentina made by the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank as long as Argentina did not meet its debt commitments. In particular, it cited at the time those cases that Argentina had lost at ICSID, but not much else. In general, there hasn't been a freezing of relations, and there hasn't been certainly no sanctions, no punitive measures, no attempt to isolate Argentina or treat it as a pariah that it should be treated as. As I say, I think partly, I think the Obama administration has a problem getting tough with bad actors all over, and the other part has been explained to me by U.S. officials that, the pros and cons, they'd rather have Argentina cooperating with the United States in keeping an eye on the Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil border area, which, might be a source of trouble, and also cooperating in drug interdiction, things and so on. But that veil has fallen in the past 2-3 years, because as far as I know, there's been very little cooperation on the Argentine side, and very unreliable cooperation in general. And so I think that now is the time to stand up and be counted and say, no, you've given us at least half a dozen reasons why we shouldn't be sitting at the same table with you and shaking hands and smiling. And there are a number of things that the U.S. government could do in various areas to strengthen creditor rights and to stand up for the right thing. On why should Americans care? I think we should care because Argentina has taken advantage of the United States. Argentina has taken advantage of U.S. capital markets. Argentina has taken advantage of U.S. investors, both multinational investors and bond investors. And it has, stuck its tongue out at them, and I think that that's not something that we should tolerate. If you want to do business with China and you can get your money there, that's something like what Venezuela and Ecuador, are doing. They get their money from China, well, okay. But if you're coming here, don't dirty the house. So I think that that's one reason, certainly, because there's billions and billions of dollars at stake that taxpayers and investors have put on the Argentine table, and they have been at risk and so on. I think that this attitude of thumbing your nose at the U.S. courts and so on, I think that that's something that Americans care about. As I say, we may not always care about what happens at the other side of the world, as long as what happens in country X stays in country X. But in this case, they played in our field, and they raised money here, and now they don't want to meet the terms. And I think that should worry us, because it's an affront to our sovereignty and to our principles.
I'll give a little different take on the Obama Argentina. I don't think in the last 15 years, 13 years, there's been much of a policy toward Latin America. I think that I don't think either the Bush administration or the Obama administration has articulated anything resembling a coherent policy toward what our interests are, what our where we want to go down there. So I think that one of the huge complicating factors is something that Arturo mentioned there at the end, and that is the world is no longer unipolar, and when they can go to China at the drop of a hat, there is the constant tension between balancing, keeping some influence, and knowing they can walk away and find another suitor. And I think for a while, Chavez also, when he had money, also fulfilled that rule. If you wanted to say, if you wanted to violate international law in your agreements, you could go get Chavez's oil money, which makes having the other shoe of drop saying, okay, if you don't, then something will happen to you, much less effective because nothing was going to happen to you. You were going to live happily ever after. So I think it's a little too easy to just blame the lack of desire for confrontation, although I think particularly with the Bolivarians, we could have done a lot more, a lot earlier, and could still do a lot more than we're doing, especially as it relates to Iran's influence. I think that one of the things that we've consistently misjudged, and I think this goes a little bit to the second part of the question, why should we care? I think that if we have countries that are willing to work with Iran's nuclear program or missile program in exchange for their own internal needs because of gross mismanagement, then you have a serious existential problem for us. And I think that that is a different order of magnitude of problem than the debt fight or the bondholders fight. I think that that's important. I think rule of law is important. But I think if you're looking at our national security interests, I think that both the criminalization of a state like Argentina is tremendously damaging to the region, destabilizing to the region. It allows illicit money flows. If you look at the law they passed that's now about to, I think, end next week, where you could bring in essentially any amount of money undeclared and put it in banks. And it was like, come launder your money in Argentina. It was completely absurd. And they didn't really get called on the carpet for it. That's, I think, one of the things the U.S. could have done, the Obama administration could have been much more vocal on, because it was a clear violation, not of what we'd like to see or don't like to see in the world. It's a clear violation of every international law regarding money laundering and the Financial Action Task Force and all of those things. So I think when you have, if it's a little different, and it's easier to deal with if it's a country like Suriname. Okay, you can cut Suriname off. Who cares? Desi Bouterse is a convicted drug trafficker. His son is now spending his next 20 years in the U.S. prison. Great. Argentina matters. Argentina is a real economy with things that we need, and an actor that can provide. I mean, I had not followed Argentina that closely until the last couple of years for a while, and I was really surprised at their level of activity in space programs, nuclear programs, medical technology programs, all these things where they have really high-end stuff on the market. And when that stuff is starting to go to people that would like to inflict harm on us, that's what I would say we should. That to me is the sort of the existential threat that we should care about. But I think we've been, everyone across the political spectrum has been significantly negligent in developing a coherent, even if they would be different ones coming from different political sectors, any coherent view of what our policy in Latin America could and should be, and then move forward to implement it. I think it's been one of these great black holes that probably a result of the post 9/11 world, but nonetheless damaging now.
Excellent. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Yes. Horacio Marquez. And the question is for Arturo. You were talking about maybe that the exit for Argentina from these problems is not painless, which I agree with, and probably I would speculate that some of that exit path goes through maxi devaluation, the traditional maxi devaluation, with the consequent rise in the tariffs of public services, plus some recession. Do you have any wild guesstimate of where the equilibrium point of the peso dollar would be, Arturo?
So, no, although the parallel exchange rates tell you something. Now, if we're talking about Venezuela, the official Bolivar is 6-something and the unofficial is like 40-something. So I'm sure that the equilibrium rate is not 40-something for Venezuela. But in the case of Argentina, it could easily be close to, let's say, the 9 where it is. But what we've learned through long experience in Argentina and other countries is the context matters, how you do it matters, etc. Namely, there have been occasions when governments have let the currency go, and it hasn't dropped a ton because of supportive, encouraging, promising, positive measures, fiscal, monetary, productive, et cetera, measures taken to change expectations for the better. So it's just a price like the stock market that reflects sentiment that day. And hopefully they have learned from how to exit prior populist experiments so that they won't do a Rodrigazo or, they won't do a maxi everything like they did in the mid-'70s, but they will do something that is a confidence building. For instance, they'll make up with their creditors and with their investors. They'll make up with the Exim banks and the foreign aid agencies. They'll stop, putting their finger in the British eye over the Malvinas. They'll stop annoying their neighbors about everything. So I think that a new leader that's, not only talking a different talk, but walking a different walk, could lessen the severity of a devaluation that will have to come.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, right here.
Kristen Jackson, formerly House Foreign Affairs Committee and currently independent consultant. What recommendation would you guys give for policymakers who are trying to push us in the right direction, do what maybe the Obama administration isn't doing, and make Argentina step up and take notice? And would you say that Christmas policy on the G20, maybe pulling together with Europe and saying, we've all been impacted by this, let's do something, they're making a joke, we're giving them a platform through the G20, and maybe addressing it that way would be a tangible approach?
I think that multilateral action that goes to their financial well-being is probably the easiest and quickest way to get their attention. I think that they've come to a point now where they sort of maxed out their China credit card as well. Venezuela can't do much more for them, so their options are significantly limited. And what Cristina really hates is being shown to be a rogue on the international stage. She values her image enormously. So when she stops in Seychelles and goes to a bank for 8 hours on her way back from her last trip, and that gets out, it's hugely damaging to her own self-image, I think, as well. I mean, how she wants people to view her. So I think that, yes, I think if you highlighted the money laundering fiasco, they didn't actually attract any money. Not even money launderers trusted Cristina this time. I think last time they did this a few years ago, they got in $4 billion. This time, I think they got in less than $100 million. So they didn't inspire the Sinaloa cartel's confidence in their ability to manage their money. But I do. So I think that highlighting rule of law issues. And I think that in my experience, I'm not Argentine, and I don't know Argentina like Arturo does. But I think that Argentines are really, as I think Latin America is really not looking for the U.S. to start pounding on people's heads. I think they're looking for them to start standing up for the rule of law. And I think that is, a fundamental disconnect between the Bolivarian project and people over time. I think it took them a while to I think the populations reacted slowly. Argentina maybe a little more quickly. So I don't think you need to be yelling at them about everything. I think if you put it within the rule of law issues to the frameworks that they themselves have signed at the OAS and at the UN, you can embarrass them and move them forward and move forward in a multilateral way. I think especially if you get the Europeans on board talking in the G20 and things, pushing them forward, you get the IMF thing just really, really irritates them. They don't have they're lying about their statistics. And the IMF called them on it. And they hate that. She hates that. Not that it's not true, it's just she hates to be shown to be that. So I think anything you can do that shows the duplicity or the lack of reliability of the government and her own personal complicity in that is probably useful.
Yeah, I think with a little courage and a little vision, the Obama administration could do a lot for its own image and to send the right signals to Argentina and to others who are looking, because I, for instance, have studied quite a bit the situation in Ecuador and the way Ecuador has treated its creditors and so on. There's a lot of Argentine fingerprints there. So it's very important that not necessarily an example be made of Argentina, but that the U.S. be siding with the good guys as opposed to with the bad guys. So whether that involves inviting someone else, and there are plenty of other qualified countries to belong in the G20 in the place of Argentina, or getting an alliance together with the Europeans and the Japanese and some coalition of the willing in Latin America to stand up, whether to the distortions in trade, which there have been lots of complaints filed with the WTO, or the situation in the courts here, or the situation at the ICSID or the multilateral. There are many buttons that the U.S. could press, especially if its allies were to press them at the same time, that I think would reassure us that the administration stands for the things we believe in, and also that would send a message, not just to Argentina, but to others who are thinking of thumbing their nose at the rest of the world, namely to discourage bad sovereign actors at least. We can't control the non-state actors, but we can at least try to influence the state actors. It's very important that we stand for something and we communicate it, and that doesn't mean putting, boots in the ground or any of those things. I think, but Argentina is a case where the downside of doing something, looks to me, is minimal. This is not righting all the wrongs in Syria or Somalia or whatever. It's just standing up for what's right. It's overdue that the Obama administration does this.
Yeah, I particularly thank you for that last question, to give them the opportunity to answer that. And I particularly like the way both of you approached it, because I host a lot of panels here, particularly over the last 6 months to a year. And on various topics, we've been doing a series of discussions on sort of larger questions of what the future of American foreign policy looks like. We call it the New Look series. And there's a hunger out there from all Americans, including conservatives and Republicans, about what are the basic interests that we have? What are the standards? Because right now there's a lot of ideological and political flux going on. You have, on the one hand, you have the people like Rand Paul, who is one of the major critics of the whole National Security Agency surveillance, making common cause with Barney Frank. And at the same time, you have Republicans and Liberal Democrats raising questions about the Syria intervention. You mentioned boots on the ground in Argentina. So this is, when I have these discussions, even though this is a topic just on one country, that's why I asked the question about the broader implications. I am listening to how all of you look at it and the questions from all of you about what really is important, because it is changing, not only in the minds of Americans, but also in the way we practice our foreign policy, which is larger really than what President Obama thinks he may be doing at any given time. So I thank you for that. I think both of you have been terrific. I think all of you asked some very terrific questions. I thank all of you for coming this afternoon. Thank you, Arturo and Douglas, for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.